Panama Canal isn't just a waterway, it's a choke point. Every single day, roughly 5% of global maritime trade passes through those 51 miles of water. It's anywhere from 40 to 50 ships carrying everything: oil, electronics, food, weapons, moving between the Atlantic and Pacific. For decades, this made Panama strategically invaluable. But it also made Panama incredibly dangerous, because whoever controlled the canal controlled leverage over the entire Western Hemisphere's economy. By 1989, one man controlled Panama. He wasn't just using that leverage for geopolitical power. He was using it to move cocaine. General Manuel Antonio Noriega was not supposed to become a dictator. He was supposed to be Washington's man in Central America, a reliable asset, someone the CIA could hand intelligence to, take intelligence from, and count on to keep the region stable. The relationship started in 1967, when the Panamanian military first recruited him as an intelligence officer. By the mid-1970s, he was already reporting to the agency. He passed along information about Soviet movements, Cuban operations, and leftist movements across the region. He was useful. And for useful assets, the United States government had historically shown remarkable patience. But here's what most people miss about Noriega's rise to power. Washington didn't create him, they enabled him. There's a critical difference. Understanding that difference explains why Operation Just Cause, the military intervention that ultimately toppled him, actually represented a catastrophic intelligence failure, not a military victory. When Noriega became commander of Panama's defense forces in 1983, he inherited an institution that was already knee-deep in the narcotics trade. PDF wasn't just tolerating drug trafficking, they were profiting from it. Officers were skimming money. Bases were being used as transshipment points. The entire command structure was compromised. And Noriega, with his CIA connections and his understanding of how American intelligence agencies actually worked, recognized something that most career military officers never figured out. He could expand the drug operation dramatically as long as he maintained his intelligence value to the United States. This is the part that intelligence analysts still struggle to explain. Noriega was simultaneously a CIA informant and a major cocaine trafficker. He was moving product from the Medellin cartel and the Cali organization while simultaneously providing the agency with information about those same operations. He had become a double game player in the most literal sense, extracting value from both sides of the drug war. And for years it worked, because the CIA, focused on Cold War priorities and containment of communism, valued his intelligence enough to overlook his criminal enterprises. This wasn't ignorance. Agency officials documented Noriega's involvement in narcotics trafficking as early as 1986. But in the calculus of Cold War geopolitics, his continued usefulness outweighed the immediate liability. Calculation changed when the Cold War ended. By 1988 and into 1989, Noriega's strategic value to Washington had collapsed. The Soviet Union was imploding. Cuban influence in Central America was waning. Suddenly, Noriega wasn't an essential counterweight to communist expansion. He was a liability, an embarrassment. A dictator who was openly rigging elections, murdering political opponents, and operating what amounted to a narco-state using US taxpayer-funded military hardware. The Panamanian people understood this too. In May 1989, when Noriega attempted to legitimize his rule through a presidential election, the opposition candidate, Guillermo Endara, won by a landslide. Noriega simply annulled the results. He had his security forces beat opposition members in the streets. He created paramilitary units called the Dignity Battalions to terrorize the population. And then in December, he made a critical mistake. He declared that a state of war existed between Panama and the United States. What Noriega didn't understand, or perhaps he understood it too late, was that he had exhausted Washington's patience. The intelligence relationship was over. The strategic rationale had evaporated. The one thing standing between him and American military intervention was plausible deniability. That's why the Bush administration didn't just invade. They constructed a legal and political framework for the invasion that made it look like a response to Panamanian aggression rather than an intelligence community cleanup operation. The F-117 Nighthawks that dropped those bombs on Rio Hato at midnight on December 20, 1989, weren't the opening salvo of an invasion designed to protect American interests or Panamanian democracy. They were the opening salvo of an operation designed to erase the evidence of one of the CIA's most consequential intelligence failures. The agency had recruited a man. They had trained him. They had protected him. They had looked the other way while he transformed an entire nation into a cocaine distribution hub. And when the strategic circumstances changed, when he was no longer useful, when the Cold War architecture that had justified his protection finally collapsed, Washington decided that the easiest solution was military erasure. But here's what makes this story different from how it's typically framed in military history books and declassified documents. The invasion wasn't primarily about stopping Noriega's narcotics operations. If it had been, the United States would have pursued extradition, intelligence operations, or covert removal. Instead, Operation Just Cause involved more than 26,000 American troops. It was a full-scale military invasion of a sovereign nation that lasted weeks and resulted in hundreds of civilian casualties. The scale of the operation tells you something important. This wasn't about surgical removal of a narco dictator. This was about containment, damage control, making sure that the full extent of CIA involvement in Panamanian narcotics trafficking and the agency's protection of Noriega for years while knowing exactly what he was doing never became the public narrative. The invasion succeeded militarily. Noriega was captured, brought to the United States, tried on drug trafficking charges, and imprisoned. He died in a Panamanian prison in 2017. Democracy was restored to Panama, in theory. Elections were held. A new government took power. The American military withdrew, leaving behind a transitional government that was broadly aligned with US interests. The intelligence dimensions of the operation remained classified for years. The full extent of the CIA's relationship with Noriega, the agency's knowledge of his narcotics operations, and the deliberate decision to protect him for nearly 2 decades. These details didn't enter the public record through legitimate channels. They were leaked, they were discovered by journalists, they were excavated from declassified documents that the government had fought to keep sealed. And even now, more than 30 years later, there are still questions about what the CIA knew and when they knew it. There are still arguments about the extent of institutional knowledge within the agency about Noriega's drug trafficking. There are still classified documents that remain under lock. This is where the Noriega case becomes instructive for understanding how intelligence agencies actually operate in practice, as opposed to how they're supposed to operate in theory. The official story is that the CIA didn't know the full extent of Noriega's involvement in narcotics trafficking until the late 1980s, that when they discovered his activities, they gradually moved towards supporting his removal. The evidence available to the public doesn't support that timeline. Internal CIA cables from 1986 explicitly documented Noriega's narcotics trafficking. The agency was aware. The agency documented it. The agency took no action. Why? Because in the institutional logic of Cold War intelligence operations, the containment of communist expansion in Central America took priority over drug enforcement. The DEA was raising alarms about Noriega's involvement in narcotics trafficking. The State Department had concerns. But the CIA, which maintained the primary intelligence relationship with Noriega and benefited from his operational value, successfully argued that removing him would create a power vacuum that could be filled by communist-aligned forces or hostile regional actors. This calculation was presented as geopolitical realism. It was actually institutional self-interest. The CIA had invested years in cultivating Noriega as an asset. Discarding him would have been an admission of poor judgment. Continuing to protect him allowed the agency to maintain the relationship while claiming that the strategic benefits outweighed the costs. What's remarkable is how long this arrangement actually lasted. Noriega wasn't suddenly discovered to be a narcotics trafficker in 1989 when the invasion occurred. He wasn't secretly revealed to be a criminal after the fact. He was documented as a narcotics trafficker in real time by multiple US government agencies while maintaining his CIA protection. The Department of Defense knew, the NSA knew, the State Department knew, the FBI knew, the DEA knew. And the CIA, which could have terminated the relationship or recommended prosecutorial action, instead continued the asset relationship, because the Cold War logic still seemed to justify the cost. It wasn't until the Berlin Wall fell and the strategic architecture of the Cold War began to collapse that the calculation changed. Suddenly, Noriega's intelligence value cratered. His threats to democratic governance in Panama became untenable. His continued rule became a political liability rather than a strategic asset, and at that point, the machinery of military intervention could be deployed. This reveals something counterintuitive about intelligence-driven foreign policy. Sometimes military interventions aren't responses to crises. They're resolutions of intelligence failures that have become politically unsustainable. You don't invade a country with 26,000 troops because a narco-dictator is trafficking cocaine. You invade because you've been protecting that narco-dictator for 2 decades, and now the political situation has shifted in a way that makes continued protection more costly than military intervention. The planning documents for Operation Just Cause, declassified years after the invasion, reveal that the military operation was designed with specific constraints. The plan wasn't to kill Noriega immediately. The plan was to incapacitate his military force, establish American control over the country, and then hunt Noriega down afterward. This timeline matters because it suggests that the operation was never intended as a precision strike against a single individual. It was intended as a full military occupation designed to transition Panama to a new political order. That new order, significantly, was compatible with American interests regarding the canal, regarding regional security, and regarding the terms on which US military and intelligence presence would continue in Panama going forward. The invasion wasn't just about Noriega. It was about resetting the terms of American influence in Panama after the institutional failure of the Noriega-asset relationship. Now, if you want to understand the full declassified history of how US intelligence agencies operated in Central America during the Cold War, there's an incredibly detailed resource that's been compiled in the description below and also pinned in the comment section that walks through the CIA's role across the entire region, not just in Panama. If you're interested in the broader institutional dynamics of how intelligence asset relationships actually work, that resource goes way deeper than we can go here. The reason this matters today is that the Noriega case established precedents that still shape how the intelligence community operates, demonstrated that an intelligence asset could maintain protection even while engaged in major criminal enterprises, as long as that asset retained strategic value. It showed that the termination of an asset relationship, when it finally occurred, could be achieved through military means if the political circumstances aligned. It established that the narrative surrounding such operations could be constructed retrospectively, with the intelligence dimensions largely obscured from public understanding. The invasion of Panama is typically presented as a military victory against a narco-dictator. From an intelligence history perspective, it's better understood as a military cleanup operation following an extended institutional failure. The CIA had enabled Noriega. The CIA had protected Noriega. The CIA had allowed Noriega to transform Panama into a narco state. When the Cold War rationale for that protection finally collapsed, the institution that had created the problem couldn't be seen to be directly responsible for solving it. That responsibility had to fall to the military, which is exactly what happened. But here's what the official narrative conveniently glosses over. The immediate aftermath of Operation Just Cause revealed something far messier than clean military victory. Within hours of Noriega's capture, US forces were racing through Panama City's poorest neighborhoods, not to hunt remaining PDF loyalists, but to secure something far more valuable: documents, safes, computer files. The intelligence archives that could expose exactly how deep the CIA's relationship with Noriega actually ran. The timing was surgical. Before journalists could properly embed themselves, before international observers could document what was being seized, before anyone outside the intelligence community could ask uncomfortable questions about why the CIA had maintained operational contact with a man who was actively flooding American cities with cocaine. What emerged publicly was the sanitized version. Noriega was a dictator. He needed to go. The military removed him. Simple, clean, American power projection working exactly as intended. The intelligence community was simultaneously engaged in what you might call aggressive historical revision. The relationship between Washington and Noriega wasn't being forgotten. It was being compartmentalized, filed away, locked behind classification barriers that would remain in place for decades. This is the critical distinction. Noriega wasn't an unexpected problem that emerged suddenly in 1989. He was a predictable outcome of a specific intelligence strategy. The CIA had cultivated him throughout the 1970s when he was useful as an informant on leftist movements and a facilitator of covert operations across Central America. By the time Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, Noriega was already deeply embedded in the American intelligence apparatus. He wasn't just an asset, he was a trusted intermediary between US intelligence agencies and various elements of Panama's military and political structures. The transformation into a narco-trafficker happened gradually, and Washington watched it unfold. The Medellin cartel needed secure transit routes through Central America. Panama, with its geography and its military strongman, was ideal. Noriega offered them security in exchange for payment. Enormous payments that accumulated in hidden accounts and offshore banks. By the mid-1980s, he was processing billions of dollars in cocaine trafficking while simultaneously holding the title of Commander of the Panama Defense Forces. The CIA knew this, American DEA agents knew this, the State Department knew this, but the Cold War logic still dominated strategic thinking. Noriega was anti-communist. He was useful for protecting American interests in the region. He maintained stability in Panama, however brutal that stability might be. So the decision was made, or rather, the decision to not act was made, and Noriega continued his reign undisturbed. This is where institutional psychology becomes critical to understanding how governments actually function. The CIA had invested enormous political capital in the Noriega relationship. Dozens of case officers had worked with him. Thousands of intelligence reports had been filed based on his information. The institutional interest in maintaining that relationship, in proving that the investment was worthwhile, the asset was delivering value, created a powerful gravitational force that pulled against any objective assessment of what he was actually doing. Reputational risk compounded the problem. If the CIA acknowledged what Noriega was doing, it would mean admitting that the agency had been protecting a major drug trafficker. Admission would have enormous consequences: congressional investigations, budget cuts, personnel changes, public trust erosion. It's far easier to maintain the fiction that you simply didn't know, or that you were managing a complicated relationship in a complicated region, to admit you chose profit and regional stability over the lives being destroyed by narcotics flooding across borders. By 1986 and 1987, pressure was mounting. American journalists started publishing investigations into Noriega's cartel connections. Congressional members, particularly in the House, began demanding answers. The DEA and elements within the State Department were pushing for action. The fiction was becoming harder to maintain. But the institutional response wasn't to shut down the relationship. It was to pretend it had never been close as it actually was. Deniability became the strategy. Noriega's narco-trafficking activities could be attributed to ambitious subordinates in the PDF. His political repression could be characterized as internal Panamanian affairs beyond American influence. The CIA's relationship with him could be minimized, reframed as a limited intelligence liaison, rather than the deep operational partnership it actually was. The intelligence community essentially began constructing the mythology that would be used to justify his removal, a mythology that carefully obscured the agency's own complicity. The turning point came in December 1989, but not for the reasons most history textbooks suggest. It wasn't that Noriega suddenly became a threat. He had been a threat for years. It wasn't that his narco-trafficking suddenly became intolerable. It had been intolerable for years. The turning point came because the strategic calculation changed. The Cold War was ending. Soviet influence in Central America was collapsing. The geopolitical rationale for protecting an anti-communist asset, even a corrupt one, was evaporating. Simultaneously, the political cost of inaction was rising. Congress was threatening investigations. American cities were experiencing a crack cocaine epidemic, and the connection to Noriega was becoming impossible to ignore in the media narrative. American military personnel in Panama were being assaulted. The Panamanian people were increasingly restive under Noriega's dictatorship. The political calculation shifted from protect the asset to eliminate the problem and control the narrative. Operation Just Cause was the solution. It was militarily efficient, politically palatable, and critically, it allowed the intelligence community to step out of the spotlight. The military would conduct the invasion. The military would capture Noriega. The military would be credited with removing a narco-dictator. The CIA, meanwhile, could quietly file away the relationship, destroy or classify the most compromising documents, and move forward. The intelligence dimensions of the operation were minimal compared to what one would expect. The CIA didn't need to conduct extensive surveillance to locate Noriega. They had maintained contact with him through intermediaries until nearly the moment of his capture. Intelligence analysis wasn't driving the military planning. The military strategy was being conducted almost independently, with intelligence playing a supporting rather than leading role. This was intentional. The cleaner the military's separation from the intelligence community, the easier it would be to construct the narrative of a straightforward military intervention against a dictator. Within 72 hours, Noriega was in American custody. Thousands of Panamanian civilians had been killed. Estimates range from 500 to 4,000, though the exact number remains disputed. Entire neighborhoods in Panama City had been destroyed. The PDF had been effectively dissolved. The intelligence community's most significant institutional failure in the Western Hemisphere had been militarily resolved without the public ever understanding what had actually occurred. The trial of Manuel Noriega was the final act of narrative control. He was charged with drug trafficking, money laundering, and RICO violations, all legitimate charges based on activities the CIA had documented and largely ignored for years. But the trial was carefully constructed to prevent any deep examination of American complicity. Noriega's defense team attempted to argue that the CIA had known about and facilitated his narco-trafficking activities. The prosecution objected. The judge sustained the objections. Classified documents were kept sealed. Testimony from CIA officials was limited. The trial focused exclusively on Noriega's criminal actions, not on the institutional decisions that had enabled them. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The conviction was legitimate. The sentence was justified. But the broader truth that American intelligence agencies had actively protected a narco-dictator for 2 decades because he was useful remained classified and officially unexamined. The institution that had created the problem had successfully passed responsibility to the military. In doing so, had ensured that its own role would be forgotten. This is the mechanism through which intelligence agencies maintain plausible deniability while simultaneously conducting operations that have profound consequences for national security and international stability. The Noriega case wasn't exceptional. It was exemplary. It demonstrated the standard operating procedures that allow institutions to pursue strategic interests without accountability, to protect assets when protection is convenient, to eliminate those assets when their existence becomes politically inconvenient. The lesson isn't that Noriega was removed. The lesson is how and why he was removed, and what that process reveals about how American power actually functions when the cameras aren't watching. The institutional interests of competing agencies collide with public interest and international law. Here's what most analyses miss about the post-invasion landscape. The removal of Noriega didn't end the structural vulnerabilities that allowed him to flourish in the first place. In fact, it created new ones. The vacuum he left behind required immediate stabilization. That stabilization depended entirely on American political will and military presence, something Washington had only committed to in the short term. Within weeks of Noriega's arrest, American officials began identifying his successor through democratic elections. Those would take months to organize and run, and Washington couldn't afford to wait. Instead, facilitated the rapid installation of Guillermo Endara, a civilian politician who had actually won the annulled 1984 elections. On paper, this looked legitimate. In practice, Endara's authority rested entirely on American military backing. He had no independent power base, no faction of the military loyal to him personally, and no real mechanism to consolidate control without direct American intervention. This created an immediate dilemma for Washington. They'd removed one dictator only to install a figurehead who needed constant American protection just to remain in office. The Defense Department kept thousands of troops on the ground. The CIA established expanded intelligence operations. The State Department began micromanaging economic policy. Panama wasn't liberated. It was administered as a quasi-protectorate with all the appearance of sovereignty and none of the reality. The drug trafficking infrastructure that Noriega had spent years constructing didn't disappear with his arrest, it adapted. Smaller trafficking organizations fragmented from the larger Medellin network and immediately began competing for control of the same routes. Without Noriega's centralized control and his arrangements with the cartels, violence actually increased across Panama in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Rival organizations fought for dominance. Local gangs expanded into the vacuum. The murder rate in Panama City climbed by 40% in the 18 months following Noriega's removal. What's particularly revealing about this period is how American officials publicly attributed the increase in violence to maining Noriega loyalists rather than to the structural conditions their own invasion had created. This framing served multiple purposes simultaneously. It justified the continued American military presence, it deflected responsibility for the instability, it allowed policymakers to claim that more force was needed, rather than acknowledging that their strategy had produced unintended consequences. The economic dimension of the post-invasion period is equally instructive. Washington promised reconstruction aid to Panama. Between 1990 and 1994, Congress appropriated roughly $2 billion in assistance. But that money came with conditions. American firms received preferential contracts. International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs were imposed on the Panamanian economy. State-owned enterprises were privatized, often at fire sale prices to American investors. The infrastructure that Noriega had controlled, ports, utilities, telecommunications, was systematically transferred to foreign ownership. This wasn't reconstruction in the traditional sense. It was restructuring, fundamentally reorganizing the Panamanian economy to serve American strategic and commercial interests rather than Panama's development. The wealth generated by the canal and by commercial activity was increasingly extracted rather than retained. The domestic unemployment rate remained elevated. The poverty rate continued climbing. The benefits of sovereignty and democratic government, which American rhetoric had promised, were substantially offset by economic dependence on decisions made in Washington and Wall Street. There's a pattern here that extends far beyond Panama specifically. When the United States removes a leader, even one who's genuinely authoritarian and genuinely involved in criminality, the removal itself doesn't automatically produce the outcomes the invasion rhetoric promises. The institutions that leader controlled don't simply dissolve. The criminal networks don't disband. The geopolitical interests that made that leader valuable in the first place don't evaporate just because he's been arrested. What changes is the configuration of power and the mechanisms through which it operates. Instead of one individual consolidating authority and American agencies managing that individual, you get fragmentation and multiplying power centers, all requiring American management and presence to prevent them from destabilizing the region further. You also get the extraction of institutional knowledge and technical capacity, the very infrastructure that made the previous regime functional in some limited sense. The Panamanian Defense Forces were largely dismantled after Noriega's removal. The institutional memory regarding counter-narcotics operations, port security, and maritime surveillance didn't transfer to civilian hands. It was simply lost. The American agencies that had maintained these relationships through Noriega suddenly had to establish new relationships with new organizations that didn't have equivalent capacity or reliability. This created gaps in intelligence, gaps in operational capability, gaps in institutional knowledge about how to actually maintain security in the region. Washington attempted to fill some of these gaps through expanded training missions and security assistance programs. But training takes time, and credibility takes decades. The new Panamanian security forces had no track record, no established protocols, no institutional relationships with international partners. They were, in effect, rebuilt from scratch, while simultaneously being expected to manage the security threats that had only multiplied in the interim. By the mid-1990s, the situation had stabilized, but at significant cost. American military presence remained substantial. Economic dependence on the United States actually increased despite the promised reconstruction. Drug trafficking through Panama continued, though the specific networks and actors changed. Violent crime remained elevated compared to pre-invasion levels. The fundamental question remained unresolved. How could Panama maintain security and stability without permanent American military presence and intervention? The answer, Washington eventually concluded, was that it couldn't, at least not in the short term. Military presence that was supposed to be temporary became permanent. Assistance that was supposed to be time limited became open ended. The institutional patterns that had made Noriega valuable. The direct control over drug trafficking routes, the management of American strategic interests through personal corruption, the centralization of security apparatus in a single figure answerable to Washington, had actually been, in some limited sense, more stable than the decentralized chaos that followed his removal. This doesn't constitute a defense of Noriega. His narco-dictatorship was genuine. His violence against his own citizens was documented and severe. His corruption was systematic and profound. It does constitute recognition that removing him solved some problems while creating others, that the problems created were neither anticipated nor adequately addressed by the institutions that authorized the invasion. The intelligence community's role in this process reveals something structural about American foreign policy. The CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency had comprehensive intelligence on Noriega's activities because they'd facilitated some of them. The agency reports detailing his drug connections, his human rights violations, and his growing autonomy from American control were authentic. Those agencies had institutional interests in managing those violations rather than exposing them. The FBI and DEA had different institutional interests, actually pursuing drug trafficking cases and holding traffickers accountable. When those institutional interests collided in 1989, something had to give. The mechanism that resolved that collision wasn't reasoned debate about policy. It was military force. Noriega was removed not because his criminal activities had finally become too egregious to ignore. They had been egregious for years. He was removed because he had become operationally inconvenient and politically embarrassing. His value as an asset had declined below the threshold of political tolerance. The institutions that had protected him suddenly discovered compelling reasons to dismantle him instead. What's particularly instructive for understanding modern covert operations is recognizing that this pattern has replayed repeatedly since 1989. American intelligence agencies have continued identifying assets with problematic behavior. They've continued protecting those assets when the protection served institutional interests. And they've continued abandoning those assets when their protection became politically costly. The specific names change. The underlying structural dynamics remain consistent. For a deeper analysis of how intelligence agencies navigate these conflicts and what the decision-making process actually looks like, from the inside, there's a comprehensive breakdown available in the pinned comment. Check, therefore, resources that walk through the institutional mechanics of asset management and the consequences when those mechanisms fail. The question that haunts intelligence professionals to this day is deceptively simple. At what point does an asset become a liability? Who actually makes that call? Because here's what the official narrative tends to gloss over. Between 1983 and 1989, when Noriega was consolidating absolute power over Panama, American intelligence agencies didn't lack information about what he was doing. They didn't lack the capability to intervene earlier. What they lacked was political will. The calculus was straightforward. A dictator who laundered cartel money and suppressed his own population was preferable to the uncertainty of what might replace him. Stability in Central America, from Washington's perspective in the mid-1980s, remained the greater threat than dictatorship, changed only when three conditions converged simultaneously. First, the Cold War was ending, which meant the geopolitical justification for protecting anti-communist assets, even authoritarian ones, was evaporating. Second, Noriega's operations grew so brazen and so profitable that they began generating visible blowback inside the United States. The cocaine flooding into American cities had traceable connections to his regime. Congressional committees started asking uncomfortable questions. Third, and perhaps most critically, Noriega made the strategic mistake of believing his own mythology. He thought he'd built enough institutional loyalty, enough financial leverage, enough regional complexity that Washington couldn't afford to move against him. He was wrong. That miscalculation is precisely why understanding asset dynamics matters for anyone tracking covert operations today. Assets don't fail because intelligence agencies suddenly develop moral clarity. They fail when the cost-benefit analysis shifts, when protection becomes more expensive than abandonment, when the geopolitical climate changes faster than the asset can adapt, In Panama's case, the transition was brutal because Noriega had built his power on a foundation of patronage rather than institutional legitimacy. When Washington withdrew its protection, there was nothing left underneath to sustain him.